onze allereerste spreker vanmiddag. Een activist en een van de initiators van Occupy Wall Street, MICAH White. En ik schakel dus nu ook voor het gemak even over naar het Engels. MICAH White is a lifelong social activist and one of the originators of one of the most consequential global social movements of the last decades, Occupy Wall Street, when he was the editor of Adbusters magazine. He has lectured widely on the future of social movements, and Esquire named him one of the most influential young thinkers alive. In 2016, he published his first book. It's called The End of Protest, a new playbook for revolution. We have a few copies here. If you want a copy, feel free to get one. It's a first-come, first-served basis, as far as I understood. Recently, MICAH founded the Activist Graduate School, an online educational institution for experienced social activists. And today he will be talking to us, I suppose, about his most recent activities and his view on the future or the end of protests. MICAH White.
Thank you. All right. Thank you to the organizers, Vincent, Deci. It's a pleasure to be here. I've never been to Holland before, and it's wonderful to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the theory of activism, and then I'm going to do something new. Is I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of what some new tactic that I've been developing, and then we're just going to open it up to questions, and we can talk about anything. We can talk about revolution, violence, whatever. Okay, so I'm a lifelong activist. I started doing activism when I was 13 years old. It's actually the only thing I've ever done. And when I was 17, I started to get some national prominence in America. I went to Palestine when I was 19, did direct action nonviolence, and then eventually ended up working for this magazine called Adbusters, which was my dream job. In 2011, I'm going to give you a very brief story about Occupy Wall Street. In 2011, the Arab Spring was raging, of course. Started in Tunisia, then it spread to Egypt, and then the people of Spain went into their squares with the Indignados movement, and they started having these consensus-based assemblies. So I was working for this magazine called Adbusters, and the founder of Adbusters and I, we wanted to bring that revolutionary spirit to America. So we released this poster and what we called a tactical briefing, which was a short email that basically said, look, there's this revolutionary shift in strategy. We are now a leaderless movement, and if we go down to Wall Street and set up an encampment and come up with our one demand, at the very top it says, what is our one demand? Then we can kick off a kind of revolutionary upheaval in America. And you have to remember those times. It was a very a heady time, because Mubarak had been toppled, the dictator in Tunisia had been toppled, and so we had that same revolutionary aspirations. But of course, Occupy collapsed, and it didn't achieve the revolutionary goals that we had in mind. It didn't achieve regime change. It did not give greater political power to the 99%. And and we'll talk about this later, but despite the kind of NGO activists who wanted to say, no, Occupy was a success because it changed the discourse and all of these kind of arguments, the reality of it is that no, in fact, it was a constructive failure. So after Occupy, my wife and I moved to rural Oregon. We had our son. My wife's over there, and Zia, my son, is over there. They're listening. And I wrote this book, The End of Protest, which you all can grab a copy. And so what I want to do now is I want to talk about some of the thinking that I did about why did Occupy fail. And most importantly, what I want to focus on is this theory of revolution. Okay, so this is the first component of the talk that I want to share with you, which is that I think that we need to basically create a more sophisticated way of thinking about how social change is achieved. So this is a diagram about theories of revolution. Okay, so when you think about revolution is a process that involves the intersection of humans with the natural world, obviously, in some sense. Okay, so you have basically four options. On the bottom of this graph are theories of revolution that say the revolution is a material process. It involves the physical reality around us. On the top are theories that say, no, revolution is something that's immaterial, something that's potentially supernatural or spiritual. On the left side are theories that say revolution is a process that involves humans, and on the right side are theories that say, no, revolution is not a process involving humans, it is a objective or non-human phenomena. So I'm going to walk through basically what this means for social activism. So the first and most common theory of social activism that we're all familiar with is voluntarism. Voluntarism is in the bottom left-hand corner. It means that revolutions are caused by humans acting in the material world. So if you want to achieve social change, then you need to get large numbers of humans to do the correct behaviors. So voluntarists, they just disagree about what kind of behaviors, you know. Some believe that we should throw bricks through bank windows. Others believe that we should organize nonviolent mass marches. Others think that we should, hop up and down. It doesn't matter what the action that they're saying we should do. It's the idea that action is what creates change. But there's another option, and this was prominent in the history of the left. With Marxist historical materialism. And this is the idea that actually revolutions are a process involving forces outside of human control. So now we're looking at structuralism. Structuralism is the idea that maybe economic forces are actually what cause revolutions. And there's been really profound and interesting research done, for example, saying that food prices, record high food prices, are what seem to trigger revolutionary moments. And so if you look at the Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, it's true. They both coincided with record high food prices. And once those food prices dropped, both movements disappeared. We also right now live in a time of low food prices. And if you're interested in this, there's actually this team of social scientists. They came up and they quantified like what exact food price, based on the UN Food Price Index, what it needs to be. And they kind of predicted the Arab Spring. They actually issued a report prior to the Arab Spring saying, look, we're getting to this threshold where there might be revolutions. There's another option, of course, which is this idea of subjectivism, which is that revolution is not something involving the material world, but it does involve humans. And so what this means is that if we want to change our external reality, we need to change our internal reality. This is this is increasingly common, I think, theory. So we need to engage in meditation, or we need to engage in, even with Adbusters, like culture jamming, or basically changing how people perceive reality. So these first three, I think all activists kind of understand, and it's also important, I want to say that all four of these are true. I'm not saying that one is more true than the other. All four are true. So now I want to talk about the fourth one, though. Because when we get to the fourth quadrant, all of a sudden people start to get like really uncomfortable. They're like, oh my God, what would it mean that revolution is a process that is both supernatural and does not involve humans? This I call theurgism, which is Greek for sorcery, means God work. Of course, the left is very secular, so we're not supposed to think about this. And whenever I bring it up, it makes people uncomfortable. So I'm going to give you a couple examples, and when we get to questions, if there's more questions about this one, we can talk about it. Okay. First example, which I think is the best example of theurgism, is of course Christianity, which went from being the only outlawed belief system. If you think about this, Christianity was persecuted for 300 years. It was the only belief system that was illegal in ancient Rome because it was a pagan society, but only Christianity you could not be. That was the only one. It went from being that, like they would throw you to the lions and kill you in front of cheering crowds, and then all of a sudden it became the state religion and the only legal religion in Rome. Well, how did it happen? Did it happen through the voluntarist actions of people in the streets marching? No, Christians didn't engage in street protests. Did it happen through food prices? No. No. What happened is that, to simplify it a great deal, Constantine the Great was marching to battle against a rival emperor when he saw a cross in the sky. That night he had a dream where he was visited by some sort of shadowy figure who told him that if you were to draw that special cross, it's called the Cairo, on your shields, then you'll win. He woke up in the morning, he told his advisors, and they said to him, oh, that was Jesus Christ that you saw last night. He put the cross on his shields, he won the battle, and that is why Christianity prospered. And within like 30 years, Christianity was the only state religion. So Christianity won because of a dream had by an emperor prior to a significant battle. There's other interpretations, like Engels has an interpretation of Christianity's rise that tries to make it more voluntarist, but I think that aside, I still think there's something interesting. So I'm going to give you another example. Maybe we don't like Christianity. Maybe that's not compelling to us. Okay. There was an interesting Russian cosmologist in the early 20th century, and he started to study sunspots. So if you guys are familiar, sunspots are basically just dark colorations on the sun, and there's an increasing and decreasing number of them throughout human history, and they tend to follow, there's an 11-year cycle, there's longer cycles, 100-year cycles, something like this. And so throughout human history, people have been recording the number of sunspots because it's a very easy observation to make. You just count them. Even to today, 7 sunspots, 20 sunspots, 100 sunspots, 0 sunspots. And so he started to study throughout human history sunspots, and he discovered, to his amazement, that revolutions tend to occur during periods of peak sunspot activity. I'm gonna just think about that for a minute. That's crazy. When the sun has lots of sunspots, revolutions tend to occur. So Stalin threw him into the gulag. I'm not kidding. He went to prison because that violates structuralism and it violates voluntarism and it violates subjectivism. It places the outbreak of revolutions into something that we can't control, the sun. Now, I bring this up because this was in 1920. He's long dead. Maybe, whatever, he's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. Except for the fact that Occupy Wall Street, the first day of Occupy Wall Street, coincided with record high sunspot activity. Okay. Yeah, I'm not kidding. So you can actually go on this spaceweather.com and it'll tell you sunspot activity. And again, sadly, for those who so much desire revolution like myself, scientists they're not perfect at predicting sunspot activity, but they are predicting that we are entering a period of epically low sunspot activity. Okay. So, yeah, right? So if you believe in theurgism, and there's, I have one more example we can talk about later. So very briefly, this is a graph that kind of lays out different scenarios for what those 4 things, and the only point I'm trying to make is that all 4 are true, and that I think that revolutionaries like Lenin and Mao and these great revolutionaries, what made them great is that they had the proper mixture of the 4. So what I'm saying is, it could be true that in the 20th century, a very strong voluntarist, structuralist approach to revolution was the effective and correct choice. But it might also be true that today, I think that activists who overly rely on voluntarism have been experiencing decreasing returns, and that there might be that activists who put a greater emphasis on the other areas might be more effective. Okay. So that's the theory. And usually, I just stop there and I go right into questions because I'm let's just talk about it. But I want to talk about one thing before I do that, which is something I've been working on. A couple months ago, I got really interested in this new thing. So I think that, when I think about what it is that activists do, I think one of the things that we do is that we develop new tactics, new ways of fighting. And hopefully these become relevant in the future revolutionary moments. So one new tactic that I'm working on that I want to share with you, we can talk about, is options trading. Okay. So options trading. Options trading is I've been trying to think about how to weaponize options trading, to turn options trading into a way for activists to both profit and achieve social change. So options trading is basically, very briefly, I'm not an expert in options trading, but very briefly, options trading is a derivatives market that allows you to basically buy or sell a stock in the future at a certain price. So it's basically a bet on where a stock will be in the future. And there's an active market on this. So let's take the example of Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs, which Occupy during our movement, that was we put him on all the posters, he's retiring. What's his name? Yeah, he's retiring now. But he was we would put pictures of him beheaded, on posters. So during Occupy, you can see here that the Goldman Sachs stock dropped 40%, okay, before rebounding, obviously. But so it reached its peak. It reached its peak about a week or two after so this graph is from July 4th, which is when I sent the very first Occupy Wall Street tweet, to 1 year later. Okay, and you can see that it reached its peak shortly after we sent the first tweet, and then reached its low shortly after, like, I think around the start of the movement, before rebounding. So had we been options trading, we would have made a tremendous amount of money. So in options trading, there's two things that are interesting. There's two kinds of areas of research that I find very interesting to try to combine. The first is that there's a lot of academic research done about what do, quote unquote, informed investors do in the options market. These are people who have, maybe they already know that a merger is going to happen, and there's been studies done about, well, what kind of strategies do they do to make money? So, and then there's another area of research called extra institutional entrepreneurs. So people have started to study activists as extra institutional entrepreneurs, and they try to say, well, what impact does activism really have on stock prices? And the research that's been done, at least one of the researchers, he's shown that, you know, boycotting doesn't work, but other strategies do work, et cetera. So the idea would be to combine these two things, basically that activists would use the strategies developed by insider traders and combine that with the research done by the most effective ways to damage stocks in order to profit from social movements. So I'm going to give you an example here. Oh, this is an example trade. So this is how much money you can make. It costs. This is the real program. This is called paper trading. So none of this. I don't have $164,000. This is just all. They give you fake money. But this is showing you, like, if I wanted to buy an option on Goldman Sachs that would expire in June, that would be presuming that Goldman Sachs stock would drop 40%, it would only. Hey, Zia, you have to go sit down. It would only cost $37. So this is because no one believes that it would drop 40%. But if you knew, based on your understanding of where your social movement was, what sense you have of the organizations on the ground, for $37 you could make a bet that would make, I think on a $37 bet, maybe you'd make like $1,000. Okay. The other thing about options is that it's transparent to the sense that people can tell the volume. So if you did create a social movement where you talked about, oh, one of our strategies is options trading, then people would be able to see whether or not it's happening. I'm going to give you one example, and then we're going to just go into questions. So Wells Fargo, I'm going to give you an example of this campaign I'm working on now. So it's one thing to say that, oh, our campaign is going to knock a stock down, or that it's going to increase a stock. But the amazing thing about options trading and why it is so, I think, such a profound thing that activists should be considering is that you can actually just profit on volatility alone. You can profit about whether or not it goes up or down. It's called a straddle trade. So with Wells Fargo, the 10-year anniversary of Lehman Brothers is coming up in September. Wells Fargo, one of the campaigns I think is very interesting if you guys are tuning into this is public housing. Okay, so in New York City, 400,000 people live in public housing. 400,000 people live in public housing. Many of them living in extremely desirable areas, like the Upper West Side. Like I think there's about 300 different public housing buildings in New York City alone. 50% of Hong Kong lives in public housing. Now, every country, a lot of countries have public housing, but worldwide there's also an effort to kind of roll back public housing because public housing is no longer considered, like if you ask someone in Manhattan, like a very expensive area of Manhattan, whether or not they believe someone who makes zero income should be able to live in an apartment in their area, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who really believes in that anymore. Whereas in the 30s, people would say, yes, that's why we have public housing. People should be able to live here. So I want to cook up a campaign around Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo is a major financer of the destruction of public housing in New York City. The anniversary of Lehman Brothers is coming up. Wells Fargo is also very hated in America, both for they have some indigenous issues, they have some major fraud issues. And so you could, theoretically, options trade on Wells Fargo, and then you could create a social movement that the goal of which is to destroy Wells Fargo. You would profit. You send a message to corporations that no one is safe, and then you invest those profits back into options trading. So this is just one direction that my mind lately I was thinking about, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to start sharing this idea because I think that it's both interesting and terrifying, both for what it means for social activism in terms of the profound delegitimization that could actually occur if this became a widespread tactic. Okay. So that's it, and I'm recently starting with my wife this school called Activist Graduate School, which you guys can all check out. but I'm happy now. What I want to do is really, I just want to, let's just have a question and answer and just talk about activism. I'm happy to move into question and answer. So thank you.
Let me give you some water first. Maybe you're thirsty.
Oh, thank you.
You should hold this cup.
Okay.
All right, so I have a microphone that I can walk with. And I can walk to any questions that are out there. Otherwise, I have questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Soren. I have two questions. One issue is that I think since the Clinton years, average American household incomes have been dropping. So first question is, why hasn't the revolution happened? Mm-hmm. And the Gini coefficient is worsening day by day, and probably now with the new Trump tax reform, it's going to get even more worse. Mm-hmm. Then the second part of my question is that, well, maybe the revolution is happening. If you look at Brexit and the Trump, we have one perspective on the revolution, but in reality, you could claim that the current move towards Trump in the US and the Brexit is the revolution happening, and it's about values and cultures and not about income.
Right. Yeah, those are two. Yeah, that's good. The two great questions. Thank you. So I think the first thing is, activists will often say, they'll say, why aren't more people protesting? Yeah, right? It drives us crazy. It's like, I'm so upset about these issues. Why isn't everyone upset? And there's something about this position, though, that ultimately it's disingenuous because the simple fact is people are not protesting because they do not believe it will work. And they are right to believe it will not work. All of the people who are organizing large-scale mass marches like the Women's March, all of these people are doing more to destroy the possibility of a revolution in America than the opposition. They have systemically turned activism into a meaningless protest that most people do not perceive as being revolutionary. Okay, so the people, what we learned from Occupy Wall Street is large, massive numbers of people will materialize in the streets the moment they actually believe that you might have a chance of changing things, which we did. There's like a 2 or 3 week period there during Occupy Wall Street where people were like, oh my God, this is really going to work. And everyone quit their job and rushed into the streets. You go to an encampment, people be bringing free food, spread to 82 countries, 1,000 cities, precisely because there was this belief in the efficacy. Okay, so one way of thinking about this is this quote from, a horrible person. His name is Hitler. Horrible person. But I think he had this quote, this really interesting way of thinking about it, which he said that people don't vote for the strongest horse, they vote for the horse they believe is going to win. And quite frankly, right now, I don't think that we should be judging people for not thinking that contemporary activists are going to win. So that's the first layer. The second layer is about this whole, the right wing, are they the real revolution? To a certain extent, yes, they are. Okay, to a certain extent, Donald Trump was the more revolutionary candidate, and I was saying this even before he was elected. If you compare him to Bernie Sanders, absolutely. He was the one who said, if I don't get the nomination, there'll be riots in the streets. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, was like, now that I lost this rigged primary, please vote for Hillary Clinton. That's a joke. That's horrible. I mean, imagine if Lenin had said the same thing, we didn't win the first round. Please vote for the bourgeois parliamentarians. No. So to a certain extent, yes, they have embodied a more revolutionary affect. And I think that the reason why, and this is that it is a soul-searching moment that has to happen within the left, is, do we even believe in revolution anymore? Because I think that what happened is that the left basically, we had a tremendous success between the French Revolution and up until, whatever you want to call it, the Cuban Revolution or the decolonization of Africa or whatever you call it, the end of the Great Revolutionary Period. And then we were like, oh my God, we tortured people. We killed people. During the French Revolution, they used to put people on barges, and then they'd have a kangaroo trial where they just sunk them all in the ocean. We know what Stalin did. We know what Mao did. So the left basically it denied the atrocities that they were committing for so long that when they finally were forced to acknowledge it, it's like that trauma we've never dealt with. So now the left actually doesn't believe in revolution. This is why I think it's happened. So the average activist in America, they may protest against Trump, but do they want to actually seize power and be in control? No, they're afraid of that. Or they create, naively anarchist ideas about how it's bad and all this kind of thing. On the right, I don't think they have the qualms. I think from the right-wing perspective, fascist perspective, it's like, hey, we were on the ascent and then we got beat. Let's try that again. On the left, it's like, hey, we won and it was horrible. Let's never do it again. So I think there's that's part of what's going on.
Thank you for that. I was wondering, how do you see the zeitgeist or spirit of the age relating to revolutions?
Well, I mean, I don't know how to answer that exactly. I mean, I think that what I would say in terms of I think that what's at stake or what's the struggle that's kind of happening and what like Occupy, I think, what Occupy revealed and then I think kind of has been foreclosed is this tantalizing possibility that we could create social movements that are largely decentralized, largely leaderless, that are able to carry out revolutions and then govern. I think with Occupy, the reason why we set up these encampments and these they were like proto-societies that we thought were better forms of democracy. And so I think that what's happening right now is a kind of struggle over who can wield social movements to achieve political results in multiple countries. If you ask me like where I think we should be going, I think that what we should be doing is developing social movements that can win elections in multiple countries and carry out a unified kind of global agenda. I mean, if you imagine Occupy, it spread to 82 countries. Imagine if that had an electoral component where it had also fielded candidates in 82 countries, and then the candidates had promised to negotiate with themselves, which would be amazing. Like if this is why the globalists and the right wing don't scare me, and why not the globalists, the anti. How ironic is it that Donald Trump is the anti-globalist? It's like things are so topsy-turvy in certain ways. But the reason why the right wing, I think, is weak is because they deny the existence of global problems, and therefore they deny the necessity of global solutions. But once they flip and realize, like, no, we need to build a global right-wing social movement that works together in multiple countries to, I think that'll be, then I'll be afraid. But right now, that's the left. The left is the one that's always dreamed of creating an international, movement. So you asked me what the zeitgeist is. I think it's still this troubling question of like, can we seize sovereignty, capture political power, but still maintain a kind of leaderless, decentralized decision-making apparatus? Or is that impossible and we have to just keep giving power to these Putins and Trumps and, the new, what is this, like the guy in China now is like president for life? I mean, it's amazing, right? So there's the two paradigms. It's like these single individuals who at least can make decisions. Whereas with Occupy, you couldn't even make a single decision. Like you go back to this sign, we told people, we're like, guys, everyone, go into the streets and let's come up with our one demand. They couldn't even come up with one demand, So obviously people are going to pick Donald Trump, who can come up with one demand very easily, versus like a social movement which has a lot of trouble even like deciding like anything. So the social movements once the social movements show that they can do that, I think it'll be good. And that's why I find things like Five Star Movement very inspiring, despite their. I met with them in Italy, and they're neither left nor right, so the left doesn't like them, but I find them very interesting because they do make decisions together as a movement, very consequential decisions for themselves. So.
All right, I have a question.
Yeah.
By the way, a comment first, maybe a comment to what you said about the right wing or the rightists or the fascists are not creating an international movement. They are. I mean, Steve Bannon is actively going around the world trying to do exactly that. I think that he is the one that has this idea that, yes, we are anti-globalist, but we're going to do this. We're going to do this at a global scale. So that that nightmare scenario, as you would put it, is happening. In fact, my question was something about what there are several aspects that are very interesting about what you're saying and. One of the ideas that I came across, you said it in one of the interviews that I read in preparation, that creating, let's say, a unified leftist movement possibly in the form of a party, also requires the recreation of some type of grand narrative, right? You need to have some type of universalizing story, basically about mankind, where we're coming from and where we're going. The same type of narrative that right-wing parties have, very clearly about, you know, where they come from, the rights that they derive from that origins, and how these should be enforced. And so, also within the context of this festival, I was wondering, how do you see the role of art within, you know, creating that narrative? Like, how do we need people to visualize it, we need people to come up with it, we need people to imagine it, and this has always been the work of artists. So I was wondering, to what extent you're also like collaborating with artists and with filmmakers and theater makers in that field.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it's significant that, like, this poster, for example, I think is a perfect example. Like, so Adbusters is a Canadian magazine, and despite the fact that Occupy Wall Street, the first protests of Occupy Wall Street started in America, it was created by a Canadian magazine, Canadian art magazine. And this poster is a perfect example of, I mean, it's ridiculous in a certain sense. And so you have Greek, these are Greek left-wing protesters in the background emerging from tear gas. You have a ballerina dancing on this famous statue in Wall Street, the Wall Street Bull. It's completely surreal. It's imaginary, you know? And like one thing we used to talk about at Adbusters is that you need to create a world for people to inhabit. So I think we did that very effectively during Occupy Wall Street. For a very brief time, all of a sudden people were inhabiting this like wild and in large sense like kind of crazy anti-corporate worldview. We all lived it, you know? It was like living in a comic book for a brief period of time. And it was, in many ways symbolized by this poster, which is not what a typical American NGO would have ever produced, because it doesn't make any rational sense in a certain sense. So, I mean, I think that's just, so that's part of it. That's the subjectivist part. That's the part of like getting people to suddenly like, yeah, like see that something else is possible. For sure, is an important and valuable part of the art process. But I think if I were like, the problem I would be tackling the most isn't so much getting people to see that something else is possible, but dealing with this central problem of like, do we even really want what our rhetoric claims to want? You know, this is the big problem for me. Is like American activists, we talk about like, for example, the resistance. I find that really disturbing. Like the resistance, I don't need to say it in this country, used to mean like, you know, hiding and killing Nazis and the freaking canals, and like it had a real meaning of like life and death scenarios, where in America it's like, I mean, during Occupy we were pretty intense, but like the resistance now is not intense at all. They should not even use that word. So I think that a lot of the work has to do with this, I think, engaging this question of like, do we even really want a revolution and what that entails? And what that entails, which I think we're afraid of, is it's a change in legal regime in which you make binding decisions on other people. This is where I think the left is afraid of. We're afraid of this fact, which is that, like, and it's symbolized by the slogan of the Occupy Wall Street was, "We are the 99%. That's the leftist fantasy par excellence. We want to pretend that we are the 99%, and that if we're oppressing anyone, it's merely 1%. And those 1% anyway are like the hyper-rich, so who cares about them? When in actual fact, the Bolsheviks, the name derives from the fact that they were the minority party. In actual fact, revolutions are carried out by small groups of people who then enforce their will on large numbers of people. And that's, I think, what the left is terrified about admitting, is that maybe we aren't the majority, and maybe that doesn't matter. And maybe that's what a revolution precisely is when a small group of people say, no, we're going to make binding decisions on everyone. So I guess what I would answer by saying is, yeah, that's to me seems to be the problem, is an engagement with, basically we need to bifurcate into two groups. Those who actually believe in revolution and those who don't. And we need to be nice about it. I'm not saying we should like fight with each other, but just be nice and be like, okay, I'm one of those who does, and I'm one of those who doesn't. Like, just separate, so that those who do can work together. Right now, it's really hard to even find each other. So that's because I think that I think 99% of activists do not believe in revolution. And that explains a lot of the behaviors that happened during Occupy Wall Street, where people like, you know, Marx has a saying, you know, don't play with insurrection unless you're willing to go all the way. We want to play with insurrection, call ourselves the resistance, but we don't want to go all the way. So that's where I wish that the artists would be engaging with right now.
Hi, Micah.
Hi.
My name's David Powell. We just met earlier
Yeah.
in the exhibition. I've been following your work and the whole program for quite some time. I'm really curious now because I've just ordered your book and I will get it soon. But this new shift of tactics into the shares, how do you? Are you? Is that how? I'm just really curious. There must have been such a huge amount of disappointment when you talk about the constructed failure of Occupy, and then which really involved amassing thousands and thousands of people all over the world, and this new change in tactics with this idea of, okay, maybe we should look into the shares and try and subvert or disrupt within the economic sector. I mean, can you say anything more about that? It's such a huge extreme, such a huge leap to go from physical occupation to online activism, or I don't even want to say collectivism, but...
Right. Well, let me frame it. I'm just presenting that options thing as one weapon. I think that what we do as activists is we create weapons that can be used by different forces. So with Occupy, we created, what we basically did, if you read our original tactical briefing, is we said, hey, everyone, let's combine the tactic that they're doing in Egypt, which is to go to a place of symbolic importance, with the tactic that they're doing in Spain, which is to have these consensus-based assemblies. Let's combine them into one and do it in America. And that's what released all of the... So what you want to do, what revolution or social movements tend to occur through three factors. One is a willing historical moment, another is a contagious mood, and the third is like a new tactic. So the contagious mood and the new tactic we can control as humans. The third, the willing historical moment, we can't. So the options trading, that's just merely, I'm just saying, let's let that be like one of the things that we put into, we can do mass marches, but also maybe when we're organizing the mass marches, we can just put a couple $100s into options trading, and who knows, maybe we'll make a lot of money and funnel that back into our activism. So I'm not saying that that's like the end all be all and all activism should be like that. But the tremendous disappointment of Occupy Wall Street, I think, is real, and it was a trauma. I think it was a very traumatic experience. I think that social movement creation is traumatic at two levels. One, there's a trauma of the of one's like ideas coming into reality. So it's very hard to talk about, but there's something that happens when. So Occupy Wall Street very literally just started as a conversation between me and another person. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And he was like, that's a great idea. Let's do it. And then all of a sudden, all these people are doing this behavior. It's actually psychosis-inducing, I would say. And if you look at, for example, there's this movement called Coney 2012, which reached a lot of prominence shortly after Occupy. He literally went insane. There's like photos of him like, he ran around the streets of LA like naked. So there's a trauma that happens from just the successful creation of a social movement, and then there's a trauma that happens from the collapse of the social movement, for sure. But I guess the way that I remain eternally optimistic, and why I think I've I started doing activism when I was 13. Most activists age out. Is that I believe the following, which is that revolution is a very unique social phenomenon. It has some very unique characteristics. So one of the characteristics about social revolution is, first, we know that they'll always happen again, okay? Because we know that we have records, we have actual records of a revolution in ancient Egypt, 3,000 years ago. So we know that for at least the last 3,000 years of human civilization, there have been recurring moments when people toppled their governments, which is reasons to suspect there's reason to suspect that for the next 3,000 years, it'll probably also occur. But the second thing that's really interesting, which is that revolutions tend to occur during when they seem least likely. This is, I think, something that's fascinating. So unlike some phenomena, like an earthquake, earthquakes are sometimes preceded by tremors. Some phenomena, even I just read recently, someone's like, scientists are predicting that, there will be more earthquakes. Like some things we can predict. Revolutions, on the other hand, seem to be something that happens precisely when people think they aren't going to happen. This is amazing observation. So what this means is that you can never be disappointed, because the moment everyone seems disappointed is precisely the moment when it's about to happen. So that is the trick. That is the perfect way to never get disappointed. So I become less sure of the possibility of a revolution when I see everyone rejoicing it, like that's happened, from the collapse of Occupy Wall Street up until now. I think it was like, yeah, this is it. We're like, Women's March and Black Lives Matter. Everyone's like cheering, now with the students in America. So the more cheering on of activism that I see, the more massification of activism that I see, the more promotion of activism that I see, the less likely I think revolution is. But the more despondent people are, the more like, it's never going to happen. That was the mood right before Occupy Wall Street. That was the mood right before the Russian Revolution. In fact, you can read that in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. He talks openly about the Bolsheviks thought there would never be a revolution. And then it happened. So I guess what I would say is like, that keeps me optimistic. And in between those moments, like I believe that revolutions are probably 95% outside of the control of humans. So in between those moments, we have an obligation to develop new tactics. And the options trading, that's just one of them. But there's, I was even just watching a video in the exhibition over there about the reflective blockades. Like we have an obligation as activists to proliferate all kinds of tactics and export them into all different contexts. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused actually about how you started the story because you said that you were an activist, well, as long as you remember, right? And it confuses me because to me it sounds logical to, have like a theme, something you worry about, and then you become an activist about that particular theme. But you are saying that you were an activist from, I don't know, from what age?
13, yeah.
13. But how can you define yourself as an activist just generally?
Yeah.
It sounds really weird to me.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that question actually because this gets at the heart of how we see social movements being created. So on the left, like we tend to orient. We're very rational. So we orient around ideas and policies, and like we have manifestos and we have like things that we believe in, right? So if one of the jokes during Occupy, people would laugh at occupiers because they'd say, "Oh, if you interview a random occupier, they don't even know why they're there. They don't even know why they're protesting." They would say that. To me, this makes perfect sense. I actually don't think people protest for rational reasons. I think that the subtext of Occupy Wall Street being the argument that we made in the tactical briefing was that we needed to get money out of politics, that our democracy was owned by corporations, all this kind of stuff. That is just the rational apparatus that you latch onto. But the real reason people join social movements is because of how it makes them feel. And this is why you have also the phenomena of people who were diehard occupiers voting for Donald Trump. Because it's not really about the rational reason. And so I think a lot of it's like putting the cart before the horse. I think a lot of leftists start from the position of like, okay, I know what I want in the world. I know what's wrong about the world. So I'm going to convince other people that what I believe is wrong about the world is what's wrong around the world. And then once everyone agrees with me, we'll go into the streets, we'll have a revolution, and then we'll do some good stuff. I think that it's actually instead that people walk past a protest and they're like, ooh, I feel kind of good in this space. Like I would see it at Occupy. People walk past an encampment and they'd be like, wow, I feel nice here. Like it's something about it. I feel alive. I feel like I've lost my fear, and then they join it. And then they look around and they say, well, why are we here? And people say, oh, it's the economic injustice. And okay, great. That's why I'm here. Economic injustice. And I think that's fine. I think that's a fine. No, that's not why it failed. The reason why Occupy failed, there's many reasons why Occupy failed. The number one reason why Occupy failed is because it was premised on a false concept of how you can achieve sovereignty. This is the most important thing to understand. Okay, so at a theoretical level, when we protest, like what are we doing when we protest? Why do we go into the streets when we protest? Okay, this is I think the most important point. It goes back to it's for example. I think it goes back to Rousseau, stated very perfectly, which is that the authority of our governments derives from the consent of the people. This is written into the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. This is a principle that is supposed to be. This is the principle of democracy, which is that the authority of our governments derives from our consent. And so if we don't agree with our governments, then we have to manifest our discontent, and one way we do that is in the streets. And once they see our discontent, we believe they have to listen to us. This is, if you look at, for example, the perfect example of this is really the anti-war marches of 2003, February 15, 2003. The idea here was that we all went into the streets. I was there. It was awesome. And we had these signs that said no to the war. And the idea was that our government would have to not go to war because, look, millions of people around the world said they don't want the war. This is not true anymore. The authority of our governments does not derive from the consent of the governed. You cannot manifest a sovereignty higher than our governments through social protest. This is essentially what the problem is. So the reason why Occupy failed is because it doesn't, to put it very simply, a lot of occupiers believed that because we were sitting in a circle, having a consensus-based assembly, that we were manifesting a higher form of democracy, then we were actually more legitimate than our governments, and that the police couldn't evict us. Because how could they evict us? We are, it doesn't make, it's magical thinking. But of course, the police listen to the person who is their boss, which is the person who's actually been elected, not just the people in the streets. So I think it has to do with questions of sovereignty. I think it has to do with the fact that that democracy is in crisis. The idea that our governments derive their authority from the people is not true anymore. And if it were true, then large-scale protests would work. They would, because you would be like, oh, I can't deny that a large numbers of my people don't want me to do this, and therefore I can't. So I think Occupy failed for not because we didn't have a program or demands, but this deeper questions of how do we manifest a power greater than our governments.
There are two things that I find very interesting in what you're saying. On the one hand is leadership within revolutions for social movements, and the other thing is democracy as an ideology and as the summum bonum of our civilization, if you like. So yeah, there are actually two questions. On the one hand, if you could speak more about leadership, and on the other hand, why aren't we questioning democracy?
Yeah. Well, leadership. I mean, yeah, I think there is a kind of. I mean, I think it gets back to this question of like. Basically, I think a lot of. I really do think a lot of like the problems with activism derive from like a failure to engage with like real questions of where does legitimacy and sovereignty derive, where does authority derive, and quite frankly, like in our society, like it derives from who wins an election. And so I think that this question of leadership is, it's like we don't have the capacity as social movements. I mean, maybe some small social movements do, but on a large scale, like Occupy was unable to really be a leader in the sense of like coming up with demands, or like if Occupy had tried to get together, for example, and say like what should be the trade policy of the U.S. vis-a-vis China, like we're unable to do it. So right now, I think that we're in this conundrum, which is that very authoritarian individuals are capable of making decisions, whereas social movements are not. So there's a crisis in other forms of leadership are needed, but they are not capable of actually making decisions. So we fall back on these on the authoritarian forms that we don't want, but at least they're able to make decisions. Like at least Trump can decide I want a trade war. Occupy wouldn't even have come to a decision at all. So that's I think the leadership. So I still believe that the future rests with the social movement that does decide how to make decisions together. And I still believe in democracy. I still believe in democracy, but again, it has to do with like what kind of democracy are we talking about? Like, are we talking about like the democracy of ancient Greece, where they would just like randomly pick individuals to occupy positions of power? Are we talking about like democracy as is done today, which is that anyone who wins an election by any means possible? What I find amazing about Trump, by the way, is like the man won an election. There's serious doubts whether or not the election was hacked, whether or not it was fair. It doesn't matter. He's still president. It's a magic ritual. It's just a magic ritual that he like successfully navigated through. So I still believe in democracy, and I think that there's a tremendous effort underway to undermine our concepts of democracy. And I think part of it's our own fault, because like I don't think, again, like revolution, I don't think many of us really believe in democracy. I don't think many, like in the sense, what I mean by democracy, democracy means rule of the common people. So let's say if we actually went onto the streets and got a whole bunch of common people together, common people including uneducated people, people without homes, just, everyone together, and said, okay, now let's decide on something really complex together. I don't think there's many people left who are like, yeah, I'm going to abide by that decision. You know what I mean? So again, I think it's like, do we believe in democracy anymore? And if not, then That's the issue. So I do believe in democracy. I do. I think that I'm like a big Rousseau fan, you know, because the way Rousseau puts it basically is that the decisions are binding because the decisions would be made by people who are like us. That's how he gets around that problem. The reason why the decisions made by these assemblies are binding is because people who are like us made the rules, and surely they wouldn't make rules that oppress themselves. Therefore, the rules will have to be fair. This is his logic. Whereas decisions now are not made by people like us. And therefore, we have a deep skepticism of the decisions being made.
The question was, why aren't we questioning? Well, like, it's not whether you're pro or, but why is questioning democracy such a issue? Yeah, why is it such an issue to question democracy and to, yeah?
Why is it a problem to question it? Well, I mean, to be fair, it's a concept that's lost its meaning. You know, like, for example, I mean, in America, like, we had a Supreme Court. One of the reasons why we had Occupy Wall Street is there was a Supreme Court ruling that said that corporations and unions can give unlimited amounts of money to candidates. So part of what's happened is that the concept is almost meaningless. So everyone believes in democracy. You know what I mean? It's like this weird, like, hall of mirrors that we're in. Like, even in China with one party and a president for life, they believe in democracy. Like, so I think that's part of what it is.
Maybe and kill people in the name of democracy.
Yeah, I agree with you. It does need a questioning.
Hi, Madeline. Nice to meet you. I have a question about what you've been saying about taking decisions and basically the solutions you've proposed so far, because from what I understood, you're trying to think of alternative ways to disrupt. So one of the ways would be through options trading. I wasn't here at the very beginning, so I'm not sure if I missed anything. But yeah, I'm wondering what your ideas are concerning alternative ways to come to decisions in those social movements. So how would people come together to decide, okay, this is the alternative we propose that, yeah, would stray people away from voting for Trump, for instance? Right. Because I'm a firm believer that people are lazy and they will just go for the easy solution they understand. Mm-hmm. So if there's no other solutions that are possible in this complex web of problems, right, then I think that is one crucial thing to think about also with social movements. I was wondering about that.
Yes, it's a very good question. So speaking like, so very concretely, let's say that there was a time when there were 3 ways to attain sovereignty. You could win an election, you could win a war, or you could mobilize large numbers of people into the streets and somehow magically what that group wanted was given what they wanted. This is maybe that never existed, maybe it did exist. In any case, I don't believe that third option exists anymore. So, as activists, that means we have 2 options. We can win wars, or we can win elections. And we can use social protests to win wars, we can use social movement creation to win wars, or we can use social protests to win elections, and we can build social movements to win elections. So I think we should do elections. I think elections, historically, you know, even Engels advocate elections. There's times in the ebbs of revolutionary history when elections become more viable than other alternatives. It might be possible that in 10 years we all say, you know what, war is the only way, and fine, we're all going to become the Red Brigade. But I don't believe that's true right now. So winning elections is a multi-layered problem, because you have the problem first of how do you stay away from orienting around charismatic single individuals? How do you create a movement that can make decisions together? How do you create basically who are the individuals that are going to occupy the positions of power, and how do you make sure that the movement maintains decision-making control over those people? So there's like a whole series of very complicated, it's a multifaceted problem. And obviously, I don't have the answer, and I don't think anyone really has the answer. So when you ask me, like, well, what will these new forms of decision-making, what will they look like? I don't have an answer for you. I mean, I can say where I find inspiring examples, 5-star movement in Italy. They just like keep marching forward, becoming more and more powerful. And I had the great privilege to meet with the co-founders of the 5-star movement, and like they got serious stuff, and they have their own platform. So the way they've organized it is they've actually vetted all of their members. They know exactly who they are, unlike Occupy. And they create, at least they used to, they create sessions where they like educate their members around an issue, and then the members actually vote. And those votes are binding on the movement. And so there was, I mean, it's the 5-star movement I think is fascinating. There's so many different ways to think about it, but one thing they did is that they won the mayorship of Rome. It turns out they're corrupt. The mayor was corrupt, but the 5-star movement is an anti-corruption party, so it was a big problem. So instead of trying to say, well, she's not that corrupt, it was her right-hand man. They said, from this point forward, we will make the important decisions for her. So this is like, for me, it's like, this is the holy grail. A social movement saying to a candidate, not a candidate, an elected representative, that we will make your decisions for you going forward. And she was like, okay, like she submitted to that. So it's a multi-layered problem, and I think instead of trying to like pretend like I have, so maybe it's the 5-star model. There's also Podemos in Spain, which is awesome, you know. There's also the Pirate Party in Iceland. Okay, like, instead of trying to say that I have the answer, which I do not, what I would say instead is that one of these social movements will create a model, a new tactic of making decisions that proves to be effective. When they do that, it will spread like wildfire. It's the same with Occupy. We created a very temporarily effective method of social protest. It was like, get in the square. We had twinkle fingers. We had certain whole rituals. And it spread around the world. I imagine the same thing as we'll wake up one day and we'll be like, oh my gosh, there's this way of making decisions together as a group that actually works. And they're doing it in this country. Let's do it here. And then all of a sudden, like, so that's how I think about it. So I think about the entire world's elections, like, you put it on a timeline, and imagine a social movement just like hopping from country to country, like, oh, America's elections in November. The entire global movement focuses on November, you know, American elections in November, but maybe the elections in Italy are in February. So then we focus on in Italy, and we just try to like do better than the previous election, you know. But what concrete form the decision-making will take, I'm not sure. I think that it has to be some sort of method where the members are vetted so you know who they actually are. But at the same time, it has to be kind of open. Like there has to be some, so yeah, basically, someone else must come with that answer. But that, I think, is one of the fundamental challenges, you know. And maybe it's unsolvable. I don't know. But I do believe it is solvable. I do believe it is solvable. Precisely because it's more powerful. Like, whoever solves it will be more powerful than Donald Trump. Let's put it that way. Whatever social movement can solve that problem will be more powerful than Putin, because they will be able to export social movements that can make decisions together, win elections together, and govern, which is quite a feat.
Yeah. We need more chairs. Can we get more chairs? Like, a lot of people are sitting non-comfortably. This thing can come out, right? Maybe we can just push a button at some point.
Hi there.
You're safe.
Earlier you said there are not enough leaders and decision makers within the social movement. Just now you said, well, I don't really have an idea of how the new decision making has to be established in the future. But isn't then the whole revolution is already dead before it even started?
Is the revolution dead before it's even started? Is it dead before it started? I mean, I personally believe that for example, the environmental apocalypse has probably already happened. So the catastrophe may be behind us. Whether or not that's also true of revolution, I don't know. I think that it's more about, one of the problems that I've been kind of thinking about lately is like, it could be like a cognitive illusion. Like, revolutions always come as a surprise. So it might be that what's dead is all previous conceptions of revolution, and that it's very hard then to see the next one. Like, it was impossible to see Occupy Wall Street. That's I have to underline that point. When I was working at Adbusters, in the months before Occupy Wall Street, we asked activists around the world whether or not a revolution was possible in their country. We asked David Graeber whether or not a revolution was possible in America. He said no. 2 months later, Occupy started. Okay, so the important point here is not that he was wrong. The important point here is that they're unforeseeable. So I have a feeling that what might be dead is like modernist notions of revolution, but but when we say revolution means, will the existing power structures be toppled, and will the people put themselves into a position of power where they can make decisions that are binding on everyone who lives in that community? That is not dead. That will happen again, absolutely. When will it happen? I do not know, but seems to me to be an essential part of the social organism, the human experience. Like, it seems to be how our civilization moves forward in a weird way. You know, I think revolutions are kind of like chemotherapy. They are like this painful and horrible process that we have to go through in order to secure greater freedoms or different freedoms. So no, I don't think the concept of revolution is dead, but I think that maybe every model of revolution up until this point might be dead. Yeah.
Great. We are, I think, at our new end time. Thank you very much, MICAH, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you for your questions.